basically China experienced such enormous growth between, let's say, 2005 and 2018, that basically China outgrew a lot of those debts, those bad debts from 2005. Okay? They outgrew a lot of those debts. Okay? Just as an individual, that is incredibly rare to happen. Okay? Think about it this way. If you as an individual rack up $1 million in debt, unless you get a brand new job that pays you 10 times what you're making now, you're probably not going to be able to repay that $1 million debt. Okay? It's pretty rare that that happens. As a country, it's even rare. I mean, China might be one of the only countries that outgrew its debts during that time. And China, between 2005 and 18, experienced such enormous growth that it actually happened. I think China is basically betting that it can outgrow its debts a second time. But I think the likelihood of that happening is whatever less than zero is.
Well, I don't think you have to be so negative about that.
I get it. Well, so this is interesting. So one of the ways China's economy grew is with the development of its quote unquote private sector, even though even private companies were basically still controlled by the state. What we're seeing Xi Jinping and the party do now is to bring more and more things under state control, which is the opposite. So is the solution to go back to trying to develop the quote unquote private sector?
So I think there's a couple of interesting points there. First of all, and I haven't had a chance to read it in detail, but apparently just yesterday or day before yesterday, China released a proposed law on managing the private economy. And if, what I've read is accurate, it seems that there is little to no chance that China will, let's say, unleash the private sector. They seem as intent as ever on, basically controlling it more and more. I think there's one other thing that we need to keep in mind. Xi has referred to the collapse of the Soviet Union as basically the greatest tragedy of the 20th century.
Interesting.
And he sees that he has had his minions and universities and the CCP spending enormous amounts of time on figuring out what happened, why it happened, and how to prevent it in China. And the short version is that he sees any release of control to the private sectors, to consumers, to individuals, anything that the party does not control as inviting disaster. And so I think we need to keep in mind that when it's discussed, well, hey, what can we do to help the private sector? That is 100% not the mindset, and is actually seen as a very real threat by the CCP.
And I think one of the issues that comes up with this mentality is that means there has to be state control. And the way it works in the communist system is at the local level, local officials are given targets for economic growth. Their promotions are on the line. Their entire future depends on meeting those Beijing stated goals. And so that creates a system where local officials have to constantly lie. And so the people in Beijing have no idea what's going on. So Xi Jinping, who knows what he thinks is going on with the Chinese economy right now?
Yes, one of the most famous example of this is the Li Keqiang index, where he said, you can't trust Chinese statistics. So we look at bank loans, electricity, and railway cargo. Okay. But I think we need to understand that not just is that the mindset of the top, but that's the mindset all the way through. And so, if you think of it like almost like a water filter, the lowest level government employee is going to filter information upwards. And then that second layer is going to filter it to the third level. And then, so by the time it rises up the ladder, a lot of these guys are probably getting reports that everything is awesome. Hey, we're doing great. And so I think not just Xi Jinping, but I think lots of others, it's very fair to wonder, do they actually understand the problems? And so when we talk about, well, why are they doing these things? I think there's two almost epistemological issues. Apologies for dropping a 50-cent word. Epistemological issues of, do they understand? Do they have accurate understanding of the data, the statistics, et cetera, of what's going on? And then let's assume that they can diagnose the problem correctly. Can they actually provide a prescription that is something beyond party control? It'd be kind of like a doctor seeing a gunshot victim and say, here, take an aspirin and call me tomorrow. Well, no, that's not what you need to do to fix the problem. So even if you see it's a gunshot wound, have you given them the proper remedy for that problem? So I think there's two very predicate issues that we frequently don't think about, that I think it's very valid to say, do they actually understand the problem, and can they actually prescribe valid remedies to solve those problems?
So does anyone really know how bad the Chinese economy is?
I think that's a very valid question. I mean, I think honestly, that is a very valid question as to whether or not anybody knows how it is. I mean, if Li Keqiang was having problems, think about how much tighter information has gotten, and not just tighter, but how much more incentive officials have to fudge numbers, okay, to make things up, to filter information. I think it is a very valid question to say, does anybody really have an idea how bad the Chinese economy is?
So I know this might sound like a very simple question, but you talked earlier about how the Chinese economy grew so much between 2005 and 2018 that it literally outgrew its debt. And now there's a less than zero chance of that happening. But why don't those same growth mechanisms work now? Like, why couldn't they just be implemented now?
Very, very good question. So first of all, China enjoyed a couple of things at that time. First of all, even after the recapitalization, they were starting from a relatively low level of consumer, corporate, and government debt. Okay. The local governments were not heavily indebted. The corporates were not heavily indebted, and the consumers were not heavily indebted. Now, by most measures, Chinese corporates and Chinese households are among the most heavily indebted in the world. Okay. And we could debate, which is the proper metric, and, are they fifth or are they 12th, but they're very, very high. So first of all, absorbing lots of new debt, one of the mechanisms that they used to grow so fast during that period is basically impossible. It's just impossible to absorb that much more debt. And think of it this way: growing from debt is one of those things. You'll sometimes hear it almost described as a drug to countries or somebody that wants to go out and purchase a home that's too big. And what I mean by that is, that first hit provides you a big stimulus. That second hit provides a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less. So now there's this number that economists have created that says, how much does each additional dollar of investment create? And basically, it's really, really low. It's really, really low at this point, meaning each time you borrow more to invest more and stuff like that, it just doesn't create the additional stimulus. So you started from a very different point. The second thing that I think was very, very different was during that period, the Chinese and not just the U.S., but really the world economy were very, very aligned. And what I mean by aligned was they were both growing very robustly. They were growing very robustly in complementary ways. They were growing in ways that their interest rates could be aligned, and so money flooded into China from abroad. And now you actually have a reversal of that. And just to take a simple example, I think US interest rates today are generally about 5%. Chinese interest rates are about 2%. Okay. So if you were in it, let's assume that you were an investor and you could, snap your fingers, would you invest in the 2% country or the 5% country? Okay. And so that's putting a lot of pressure on China to keep money in the country because money wants to leave China to go invest in the 5% economy. Even Japan has raised interest rates slightly. And so you don't have that alignment now, or I think for the foreseeable future, in the Chinese and other economies that are helping boost Chinese growth.